Bijan Omrani, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
A real pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I wish I'd pressed record when you did log into this online studio, because we just had a fascinating discussion, which was around the context of your book, which is soon to be released and may well be released by the time this show comes out this Friday, which is God is an Englishman, Christianity and the Creation of England. And I'm sure we'll be able to rehash that discussion a little bit later. But you've taken on a mammoth task here, which was to talk about England, how it came into being, how it is inextricably linked to the Christian faith, and what it is that we risk by no longer living that faith as Englishmen. So I don't end up butchering your wonderful book, what was it that motivated you to take on this rather mammoth task?
I first conceived of the book in miniature. I think probably in about 2018 or 2019. And it was really in response to a book that came out about the inheritance of wisdom from the classical world to the modern world. And the book argued, quite wrongly, that Christianity was responsible for the destruction of a vast swathe of ancient wisdom. It rehashed a lot of those old tropes about these thuggish monks who thought that the only wisdom and the only learning possible was from Christian scripture, and therefore everything from the classical world had to be tossed into the fire. And it made a great play of these rather like the Taliban, I suppose, these Christian monks in Alexandria beating up Aspasia, the great female mathematician and philosopher of the ancient world. And it suggests really that it was Christianity that was the dividing line from the enlightened, moral, wise freedom of the ancient world with the darkness that fell with the collapse of the Roman Empire. And it is rehashing that Gibbonian idea that Christianity was really responsible for a whole swathe of the world's ills for centuries, after the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. And I looked at this thesis, and I have a background. One of my past careers was as a classicist and a classics teacher. So I'm very interested in the way that the knowledge from the ancient world got to the modern world. And it struck me that the entire thesis was representing only a tiny sliver of the truth. And it was really the case that Christianity was, far from being responsible for the destruction of ancient wisdom, towards the collapse of the ancient world, which was really driven by issues of economic collapse, demographic change. Really, Christianity was responsible for saving and using a vast amount of the ancient wisdom. So it struck me that, hang on a moment, this one book is focusing on education and the transmission of classical wisdom, and it's going for this rather tiresome, Christianity, what a terrible thing it is. It's caused all sorts of chaos. And I thought, wouldn't it be good to turn it around and actually say, hang on a moment, this is all wrong. Christianity, actually, we owe it a lot in the educational field and in terms of the tradition and handing down of wisdom from the classical world. But then it struck me, well, if you can do that for education, you could actually do it for a huge number of other things. Because, again, another escapade from my earlier life, I trained as a barrister. I never ended up practicing, but I did go to law school. And in the law, Christianity is owed for a lot. I'm sure we can talk about this further. But the way that Christianity has influenced the development of English law is something that you won't hear about in your day-to-day practice in the law school. And then in so many other fields, music, art, literature, people have been trying not to talk about Christianity or its contributions to ethics or charity. So I thought, why not a book that actually tries to fix the way that Christianity has been a boon to us and has made so many of the things around us we just aren't giving it credit for. And I thought it has to be just England, because, of course, Tom Holland very bravely took on Western civilization as a whole. I didn't feel quite equal to that task, and I didn't even feel quite equal to doing the whole of Britain, which, I mean, is very harsh in Scotland and probably tricky for selling books in Scotland or Wales. But each nation of the Union has distinctive traditions. So much is shared between England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, the island of Ireland generally. But there are many things that are distinct. And I thought I can only really do justice to one nation in the Union, and that is England. But of course, from that, I mean, you have the roots of many things beyond an empire, the spread of the common law, the spread of the language. So even though it's focused just on England, there are many ramifications which touch on the English-speaking world and the Commonwealth more widely. So it was that thing that really started me off on this quest, was this work.
Well, let's think about the context of faith in England, and well, we can say Britain for shorthand because it's probably much the same in Scotland and Wales, at least, perhaps not as much in Northern Ireland, where I think probably observance of the Christian faith is still pretty high in comparison to the other nations. However, I think it's fair to say that we have been under the spell of a kind of secular liberal humanism for, I don't know how long you could ask how long a piece of string is. I suppose you could look back to the 19th century and the great scientific advances. And there's a great book by A.N. Wilson called God's Funeral that talks about the impact of all of this on those who were living with faith and how it led to spates of suicides and depression, because this once solid worldview and outlook on life and the way that they'd been living was suddenly called into question by these rather strident scientists that were making strides across various different fields. Or you could say it was the 1960s cultural revolution, or anywhere in between. But I think it's fair to say that people aren't really living out the Christian faith. We can see that in the perhaps how laws have begun to change in our approach to certain things, whether it be marriage, whether it be abortion. These are things that are not exactly in keeping with the Christian inheritance. So let's look for the more positive picture. What would you say the English and the English nation could gain if it was to rediscover its Christian heritage?
I think this is a question. It's a very big question, and it has to be answered on several levels. And some of those levels really are within the heart of every individual. I mean, in my book, and it's just the conclusion of the book, I talk about the idea that Christianity, regardless of everything that has happened, still has a spiritual power and a spiritual meaning and the offer of salvation and wholeness. And that's something which ultimately is going to be within the heart of every person. And I cannot answer for the heart of every person, but I do make the claim that it still has a spiritual offering for everyone, individually. But retreating from that, there is a notion, I suppose, of the collective spiritual offering and the collective moral offering. That's, I suppose, the higher level of the pyramid. And then I think one can go below that and look at things collectively in terms of collective culture and the way that we live our lives as a nation. So if we go on to the middle rank, which I suppose is the spiritual, the spiritual collective level, Christianity still has a huge set of lessons to teach us morally and it still has this collective spiritual offering. So, for example, those ideas which I think got taken seriously in the 18th and 19th century with the evangelical revival, the idea of the dignity of every person, because every person is made in the image of God, and the God became man and dwelt among us. Those ideas are fundamental to the way that our society has developed in recent times. So in terms of our ethics, of the way that we treat each other, in terms of charity and relationships, the evangelical movement felt that we had to work towards treating each other with the inherent dignity that is within every person. So they developed ideas of charity, which we still live off nowadays, and I think are weakening, because with the 1960s, there's now much more of a focus on the individual, the satisfaction of the individual self, ahead of the idea of service of others. So what do we have to gain from that morally? Well, morally, with a return to Christian ethics, the idea of the dignity of every person, there is an imperative towards an idea of service. What can we do for everyone else? How can we help society more widely? How can we help our neighbour? How can we support everyone collectively? And I think that is an incredibly important thing. How can we work towards the dignity of every person? So I think in terms of practical things, I mean, it might just be a very local thing, a very neighbourhood thing, a very parish thing. Can I volunteer? Can I help out? Can I make the tea? But then again, of course, it has a profound impact on ideas of the way that laws and public life develop. I think in terms of the way that the ethics of politics work, in the 19th century, people following from that evangelical impetus were bound deeply by notions of conscience. So they behaved well and energetically in public life and with an ethic of service because they felt God was driving them to do so, and they were answerable to God, and that they mustn't waste their time, and that they mustn't indulge the self, and that they must behave morally because they were accountable. And I think that ethic has, again, with the decline of Christianity, has gone away from politics, so that you can put down as many rules, codes of ethics externally, but if people aren't going to adhere to them internally, then you can put down as many rules as you like. They won't be adhered to. And then in terms of laws, I mean, I think for me, the assisted dying, you might call it debate, I mean, that's what they call it, but it really is, of course, assisted suicide debate, is one of the most disturbing ideas that comes from this decline in the notion of the dignity of the individual, and the idea that that might be passed through. I think that notion would horrify a lot of the 19th century evangelicals who worked so hard to develop dignity for the aged, the infirm, the blind, the deaf, the disabled, people who were disadvantaged, because even though it might help some people in extreme suffering who are privileged and can control the way that they are treated in this situation where doctors can suggest people take their own lives to prevent physical suffering, of course, many people who are not privileged will inevitably feel compelled, as we see in Canada, I think the Netherlands, to take that path. They're a burden. My life isn't worth anything. I shouldn't be a burden on anyone else. I don't have any inherent dignity. You might as well do away with me. It's not profitable for me to carry on living because I'm going to start seeing my worth in terms of money rather than the notion that there is an infinite dignity in me that comes from my being made in the image of God. So you have that moral set of ideas which come from the Christian presence. And also I think a very important thing that Christianity gives us in public life, and that the more it's there, it protects us in another way, in that it's a sort of opposition in residence to the wide secular paradigm that belongs to government and modern life. So we see it in the very arrangements of the world, the landscape. You can still go into a parish church, and in that parish church, there is no imperative to sell you something or to value you in monetary terms. You are there in a space which is generated by reference to 3,000 years worth of spiritual heritage. And you are there in the perspective of that inheritance, and you are valued there in terms of that perspective, in terms of the divine, timeless perspective. And that is a protection against a modern world which is relentlessly trying to value people on their earning potential or their beauty, or what they're worth in very definable. And what Ian McGilchrist, that was a great contemporary philosopher, might say is the left brain thinking of just seeing things narrowly rather than in terms of the matrix of the whole. So the more I think Christianity is present with us in public life, it's a protection for the totality of our humanity. But then there's a cultural level, I said, which is lower down the pyramid. And it's that, since the 7th century, the Bible has been a fundamental text. Liturgical ideas have been fundamental to us. It was a given from before the Reformation or after that everyone would know the Lord's Prayer. Everyone would know the Creed. After the Reformation, people would start to know the prayer book, the responses, and then afterwards, Christian music, Christian liturgy. And these become cultural commonplaces. Everyone knows them. Not only do they fix in us a sets of shared ethics, so we know how to behave, but also they're simply cultural reference points that make it easier for us to talk to each other. So originally, we would be able to quote our hymns at each other, scripture. Everyone would know it. And it would be easy to talk to each other and then to base cultural creativity on that shared set of biblical and Christian literature, and then music, and then art. And then, of course, you have the rise of television. And at least then we only had 3 and then 4 channels. And at least everyone was watching Morecambe and Wise, and we could all tell Morecambe and Wise gags. 20 million people watch it. Everyone could at least share that. Or soap operas, EastEnders, when everyone watched that sort of thing, Coronation Street. But now that's gone, and you've had this shattering of culture into a million fragments and shards of internet channels. And suddenly, we are not singing off the same hymn sheet. So you have this cultural fragmenting, which makes it incredibly hard for society ethically and culturally to hang together. So, sorry, it's a very, very long answer.
This is the place for long answers.
That's very kind. So I tried to do the entire pyramid. A pyramid isn't very Christian. Well, actually, it's the Trinity. It is, but every level, from top to bottom, from the spiritual to the very pragmatic.
Let's think about the traditional aspect of it and what it means to cohere a society around something, whether it be a common set of songs or, as you say, scripture or cultural references, which the Bible is the underpinning of all the canonical texts in Western civilization. When people want to reload the canon of Western civilization, they're typically putting forward ideas and books that aren't making the same reference points. They are, if anything, they're going counter to the reference points of the biblical ideas that Chaucer or Shakespeare or whoever else has written about Milton. But you've written a few really touching passages, actually, or things that really touched me as I was reading your book. And I think one of them was centered around you being at a public event where the national anthem was sung, and you started belting out "God Save Our King." You're one of the only ones who's doing it. Or indeed, it might have been another hymn. You look like you're going to interject there.
Yes, it wasn't the national anthem, because I think people still vaguely know the national anthem. Maybe it was "O God, Our Help in Ages Past."
That's right. Yes. No, you're right. You're right. That's exactly what you were writing about. And you were with your daughter, and your daughter looked at you like you were some kind of alien, and there was hardly anyone else who was able to sing along. And it took me back to my upbringing. And I was born in 1987. I went to a nominally Church of England school. It wasn't particularly religious, but we'd have our Friday assemblies, sometimes more frequently than that. There would always be hymns. I must admit, because I came from a non-religious household, I did not know the Lord's Prayer, and I just mumbled my way through it. But anyway, I remember the hymns, absolutely loving them, and they were something that all the little girls and all the little boys would be throwing themselves at. And anyway, I started to reflect on my own nephew, who's now 11 years old. And when I see the difference in how their nativity play is played in pure reference to things like reality TV shows, and there's almost no biblical references at all, with the exception of the names, and that's about it, compared to the way that we played that particular scene, or the hymns, they effectively aren't sung anymore. And it makes me wonder what exactly it is that we've replaced this with. I mean, there's certainly no overarching system, but I think, just so people don't think I'm trying to make an aesthetic point that we should just all sing the same songs as we've always sung, is since I've come to throw myself at the tradition and the faith, there's a sense of depth to human life which I've picked up that I didn't get before. And I suppose I started to recognize I was being inducted in, at least at a surface level at primary school. But now no one's getting that. And as you say, in the modern world, we're all swirling around algorithms, being fed what it is that we might like. We're being assailed by information from everywhere. Our hormonal systems and our various pleasure-seeking systems are all constantly looking for distractions, and we're being inducted into nothing. We're missing out on the depth of human life that Christianity actually allows you to understand in its warts and all, at an individual and a collective level. And I suppose that's a very long way of preambling toward a question, which is centered around a live debate that goes on. There are some who say, do you know what? We should reheat Christian civilization, and we should have a top-down messaging from our cultural elite back to the way it was. We start with the pedagogical process. We get people inducted into the Athens and Jerusalem traditions. And then there are others saying, no, anytime that we've ever tried to get Christian civilization off the ground, it's ended badly. It's ended in persecution. It's ended in whatever else that you want to talk about, repression. This Christianity should be more about individual conscience. Where do you stand on the matter?
Gosh, very, very big question. I don't know if one can point to a particular time as an apogee of Christian civilization or not, but I think at its best, there is a reconciliation between the idea of individual conscience and the connection with tradition. So maybe if you see Erasmian Christianity in the early 16th century as reconciling the classical tradition, the notion of conscience, the notion of individual piety, the capacity to use learning and scholarship to interrogate scripture, then, that is something which seems to have it all. You have the tradition, you have the access to learning, but at the same time, you are empowered individually to hear the voice of conscience, which may be the prompting of the Holy Spirit to move you in one way or another. I think that, I mean, the problems that derive from that ultimately are the incapacity of people to find a way of reconciling different approaches to Christianity in which their conscience might prompt them. But that's not a failure of the tradition. That's a failure of people using Christian moderation to find a way of living together. And I think, I mean, maybe that's a reading of the religious chaos following the English Civil War, which I think we did much better with in the 18th and 19th century, where many traditions of Christianity in England were capable of being reconciled with each other. But I mean, I actually want to just draw on and elaborate what you were saying earlier about this whole question of deracination. And I mean, the whole notion of hymn singing and the value of engaging with the tradition. I mean, the idea of singing hymns in an assembly, say you were at primary school earlier on in the 80s, all the schools would have had a piano. They would all have sung hymns. Some would have been more modern. It would have been When I Needed a Neighbor or Kumbaya. Some of them would have been more traditional, like Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past. But when you put that music and that tradition of hymn singing in its wider context, Christ himself is said to have sung hymns in the Gospels. It was something that was even indeed deeper in Judaic tradition, the traditions of singing. The Psalms are songs. The tradition of plain song, from which Western hymnody takes its origins, certainly attested by the 5th century AD. There are still hymns which, in translation, are sung, which were written by St. Ambrose, Tertius, Fortunatus, so towards the end of the Roman Empire. There are very ancient tunes, which I won't sing them now because I don't want to frighten your listeners away. But they certainly go back that far. And then the elaboration of the plain song tradition into the great traditions of Renaissance polyphony, with Byrd, Tallis. I mean, this is something that develops over hundreds and hundreds of years, which we managed to save after the Reformation. And then the revival of hymn singing, which happens in the 18th and 19th century, that itself, with great translators like J.M. Neale, they based a lot of it on the precedents of hymn singing from the pre-Reformation age. So if you think of those children in the primary school belting out Kumbaya or When I Needed a Neighbor with a piano, remember organs were developing in, say, the 14th, 15th century. Many churches had them before the Reformation, many taken out, but the reintroduction of musical instruments and organs, firstly the West Gallery tradition of bands in churches, and then back to organs in the 19th century. There's a huge cultural tide behind that singing in the school, in the primary school assembly hall, which connects us very deeply to tradition. And then that goes into the style of the song goes, the hymns go, and instead of singing hymns or anything hymn-like, it starts to be popular music post the 1960s. We don't have a musician playing a keyboard. We have computers playing MP3s, MP4s. It's very difficult to sing melismatic, syncopated tunes. They're very hard for children to sing. And the themes change. When I Needed a Neighbor, Were You There? So, I'm not going to sing any Celine Dion or anything, but very much things about the actualization of the self, you might say. If you want to be my lover, no, I'm not going to go any further. a change of theme, a change of perspective. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. I mean, it's extraordinary for children to be singing something that gives that deep sense of perspective, both in terms of where am I vis-a-vis eternity, and also plugged into a tradition which almost feels eternal.
Mm.
And that's a deep loss. And if you don't have that sense of that grounding and that capacity to think about profound ideas, which is given to you by culture, then of course you're going to feel deracinated. And ultimately, when you start to ask big questions, as is inevitable, you're not going to have the deep well to draw from culturally and then spiritually.
Mm. Well, that probably leads me on to a question which I got from page 1, I think, of your book, where you argue that England's loss of faith is more consequential than Brexit. Why?
Brexit, in reality, is, in practical terms, about a set of trading relationships, freedom of movement, the question of whether we allow a particular foreign court's jurisdiction, and not unimportant things. I mean, of course, if people cannot exercise their rights of free movement, their right to work abroad, of course, it's going to change people's lives. And some people have chosen to use Brexit as a question of modern identity. I think the idea that being pro-EU allies yourself to an elite is something that really drove the debate. It was really a class question internally, as much as anything. And that is the closest it got to being a cultural question, because there's a cultural sophistication that I think is inherent with the notion of being pro-EU. And the idea of being local and attached to this place was seen, as I think, as rather low status. But Christianity has given us the very existence of England as a nation state. It was a foundational principle behind laws. It's a sort of driving principle behind our ethics. It's been a driving principle behind a vast amount of our culture. I wouldn't say everything behind our culture, but a vast amount of our culture. And the break from that, so, I mean, hymn singing is just one aspect of it. But, I mean, so many ideas in terms of spirituality, literature, how we arrange the public sphere, what we think are important in terms of our ethics, charities, laws, the way that we treat each other, that is far more profound and ancient than Brexit. Our relationship with the EU is the 1970s. Our relationship with Christianity is 597 or before, depending on where you start the clock. I think it's easiest to start the clock in 597 for practical purposes, but this, Christianity made the nation state. Christianity made kingship. Christianity made the basis of the development of law, arts, landscape, all of this. And suddenly we start to move away from it. So we move into a completely untested world. I mean, you might argue vis-a-vis the European Union, we've gone through periods of relationship with supranational bodies, particularly with the papacy, from, say, the 1100s to the 1530s. And indeed, I suppose, relationship with the continents vis-a-vis the northern and Plantagenet kings. So, that's not unusual for us. But the absence of Christianity is completely unprecedented.
So when you find figures talking of the cultural changes since, let's just put a line in the sand, post-war Britain as being the instantiation of a year zero, we're bulldozing the old order, as it were, for whatever reason, it's not served us, and it's not progressive enough, and it doesn't allow us, as you've talked about, to self-actualize. It's quite repressive, and actually libertinism is what we ought to strive for in some way. It's me to make the sovereign choice no matter what, and I suppose there are many different variations of that. When people say that we are being governed by those with a year zero mentality, does that stacks up? Then it's not an unfair accusation to be making.
Yes, I mean, I don't like to comment on this is a rather unfortunate public relations strategy of the Prime Minister at the moment. But it was very telling over Easter that he thanked Christians at Easter time for their contribution to national life. And now the word contribution is very telling, of course, isn't it? Because it suggests it's one thing amongst many rather than the foundation and cornerstone of what we happen to be. So that I found that very striking. But it may just be a lack of knowledge, but maybe it is a policy of trying to relegate it and to move away from it, indeed to generate a year zero notion, so that England is governed not from a tradition which is based on Christianity, but really from an imperial oversight tradition of many different religious confessions and a balkanized sort of state, which is an alarming idea. And it's also unnecessary, really, because I think, and I argue this in my book, that actually if we did hang closely to Christianity and more confidently, it actually does offer us a much more secure basis for the happy relationship between different faiths in the country. So I think, again, it's part of the consequence of the lack of confidence. If, I think the official reasoning goes, we've got to treat Christianity as one thing amongst many, but actually I would argue that if Christianity is secure in the public sphere, it's actually easier for other religions to feel happy and secure in the public sphere because they have a sense that instead of a secular world, there is a place for religion in the public sphere. Christianity will look after other faiths. And also, it's rather discombobulating, I think. I think particularly for Muslims, to have this notion that there is a government that is not based on religion in any sort of way. And that makes the profession of religion in public life per se, by any religion, actually rather difficult and worrisome. And I think you can compare our model with France, where you have this very strident laicite and religion appearing in public life as being something that seems wrong per se. But of course, there's a sense of resentment, I think, from immigrant communities that has this notion that, well, your notion of laicite is just a secularized Christianity, and you're using that as a shield to protect against any sign of Muslim presence in public life. And of course, that makes a greater tension. If you actually said, okay, this place is Christian, of course you're welcome to practice your religion here, but Christianity will be the thing which sets the tenor for public life, then there's no sort of ingrained resentment that you're saying one thing and actually using it as a shield for Christianity which won't show its face.
I also think there are some who arrive on European shores from lands where other faiths are more routinely practiced, who they actually see the country more clearly as a Christian land and are quite flabbergasted as to what they see when they arrive, which is a disavowing of that inheritance and heritage. And I suppose that can cut many ways. There can be a sense that the country they've arrived in has no real self-respect. I'm talking more about the Western European nations. This isn't as true in Poland, for example, but they would not have the same experience with immigrant groups. So there's the self-respect question, but I think there's also there's a decadence question, isn't there? They see that the decisions being made within public life, whether it's around bodily autonomy, and the impact that has on whether it's the number of children being born or what we do with our elderly, or how it is that we want to educate on matters of sexuality and sex education, and how we have, I suppose, gotten rid of many different temperance movements that have popped over the years. We've been a boozy nation for as long as can be remembered, but there's always been a temperance movement of some sort, whether it's the Methodists talking about the demon drink, and even miners in the north of England where I'm from, they weren't as heavy drinkers as you think they were, because they actually were so cleaved to their faith. And yet now, and I grew up in this era and I partook in it many times, we've got the binge drinking culture, and there's this sense of it's a free-for-all, and there's a disrespect, I suppose, of what's gone before. And I suppose one person in public life who I think gets this, and he talks about it quite frequently, is Ricky Besan, of Bengali extraction, proud Brit that he is. And he talks about, look, I might be Muslim, but I'd much rather live in a country that was much sure of its Christian faith, and spoke about it. And instead what we get are pronouncements from the Home Office, a little patchy abstract Easter egg saying Happy Easter on it, not a crucifix or a stone rolling away from the tomb in sight, nothing even referencing the Christian faith. And you wonder what on earth's happened here that we've gotten to the point that we're disavowing it. Another question, I suppose, Bijan, is why do you think Christianity's malaise, and I suppose, frankly, its disappearance from public life at this point, unless a prime minister is told that he probably better put a message out to Christians, why do you think it is accepted without debate? What are the reasons behind that?
I think one of the reasons, and this is going to, I think, come back to the discussion we were having before you press the record button, is to do with inertia and laziness, and also a certain sense of fear and contempt at ourselves for losing what we had, because the transmission of culture, and certainly Christianity, is something that requires effort. So if we are going to pass Christianity on, or indeed culture generally, you have to read the Bible, you have to go to church, and you have to learn the liturgy, and you learn songs, and you learn ideas, everything that's associated with it, and you have to practice ultimately a Christian way of life. And that's very hard work. Now, it was easier before, in my view, the 1960s, because there was nothing else to do. There were no televisions, there were no radios. Well, no, that's not true. Of course, radios were earlier, but the technology spread very quickly in the 60s. LPs become much more available. Cars become much more available. Houses become much more comfortable. Central heating. Leisure time offers many more choices, partly because of transport, but also proliferation of other things. And it used to be the case that you had to be within local groups, clubs, societies, many of which were based around churches and chapels, in order to participate in cultural life. So you start with religion itself, you start with the faith, and then you associate within the faith in other activities. Now, with this perfect storm of technology in the 60s, the LP, the car, technology, and also this change in the notion of what is psychologically valid. These ideas that come from the west coast of the States that say, actually, don't worry about pressing down desires within you if they don't accord with what works for society. Let it all hang out. Satisfy yourself and give yourself what you want right now. And I always think of the slogan for the Axis credit card in the 1970s, taking the waiting out of wanting, which I do remember being in adverts even into the 1980s when I was a child. When all of that piles onto these societies which pass on culture, they just shatter because it's very difficult for them to compete with these very exciting, flashy new technologies and possibilities. So people stop associating, they stop going to church, and they stop passing down culture. And it makes it very hard for the cultural transmission. So why are we in the state we are now? Just coming back to your question, I think from the 1960s, and again, partly with a collapse of self-confidence in the church, people stop using traditional liturgies, generally speaking. They stop singing the traditional hymns. They stop using the Book of Common Prayer. They stop using a lot of the traditional culture, which is associated with those old societies and life around the church. And then lots of the poetry, you might be reading metaphysical poetry, you might be reading John Milton, more widely you might be reading Shakespeare, you might be reading books of sermons. They become harder to understand if you don't know the Bible, you don't know the liturgy, you don't know, say, the music and traditions of hymns around Christianity. So you stop reading all this stuff, and then people stop teaching it. And then the next generation doesn't know any of it at all. They've got a consciousness that is there, and there might be a few people who know about it. But you look at the past, and they say, oh, well, it used to be the case. We knew our hymns by heart, we knew the liturgy by heart, we knew all this stuff about the Bible. Now we don't know any of it. That's really rather frightening. We're rather poor in terms of our cultural capacity compared to the earlier generation. And our culture has been outsourced to the radio or LPs or CDs or the internet. No, and it knows much more than we do. But the presence of the earlier generation is a constant reminder that we have declined in what we can do in our capacity to engage in culture and to be culturally creative. Therefore, those ancestors, they're frightening. They were much better than us. And when we think about them, it reminds us of how bad we are, how else impoverished we are. We must have faced their memory. We must have faced the culture that went with them. So, pulling that back to your question, it passes away more quickly because we're frightened of what we've become in the face of what we've lost. And we don't want to be reminded of that. It scares us and it shames us. So we pretend it wasn't there. We are called, I think, I think Christianity calls us profoundly to be creative beings, culturally creative, spiritually creative. O Lord, open thou our lips, and our mouths shall show forth thy praise. So that's the response that opens Matins and even sung in the Book of Common Prayer, and of course in the wider Catholic liturgies. It's also used in various services. And at the moment, we've lost that capacity because of that profound cultural interruption. We don't have all of these cultural capacities that Christianity helped us to have. So we can't be creative in the spiritual context, and we also can't be creative in terms of the pure context of the society, the way that we once were. And we don't know as much. And we're ashamed of that. So we try to hide our shame, like Adam and Eve suddenly being conscious of, we must put on a fig leaf. And we try to pretend that there weren't people who in generations before had these amazing cultural capacities, who knew their scripture, who knew poetry, and could talk about it and use it as a basis for social interaction and their own creativity.
I've had a adjacent conversation with Ed West and Paul Morland on the show. They have a podcast called the Canon Club, and they are themselves doing it because they feel responsible for trying to help people access both heralded and unheralded contributions to the canon and the people behind them, and indeed because they want to learn about it themselves, because they at least Ed, I think, would say he's ashamed that some of the things he doesn't know and he's being introduced to it the first time. But I do recognize, I think, when you're talking about the sense of what's the right word to use here, the sense of inferiority to those who came before us, potentially driving us to look the other way, or indeed offer things that just don't even hold a candle to what came before in their place. And so what I was talking about with Ed and Paul was, could you even add to the canon now? Could anyone in the modern era really add to it? Unless, of course, they were steeped in Athens and Jerusalem, unless they really understood it and lived it and wrote or composed through every fiber of their being, because it's connected to Athens and Jerusalem, whether it's Bach or Mozart or Shakespeare or Milton and all the people we've talked about, Dante. I don't think they could. And yet you will find in schools today, and I know you've been at some of our most prestigious schools, and I wouldn't want to talk about those, but I know of some pretty prestigious schools that have teachers that want to reload the canon in some way. They want to add to it, and they want to do so with modern works. But those modern works aren't, as we were saying before we started the show, Bijan, they aren't making the same reference points. They don't speak to one another. That doesn't all hang together. All of that was an emergent property from a common root. And to give an anecdotal example, my fiance, she is a head of English and loves literature, and had always given both the classics and modern novels and works the same time of day, really. But now she finds it increasingly hard to pick up anything written in the modern era because it feels clunky, it lacks depth, it doesn't speak to the center of what it means to be a person. And so I suppose, unless there's some kind of a revival, and there are some who suggest there is, and perhaps you could say anecdotally there seems to be. I mean, France has had record baptisms and initiates into the Catholic Church this year. There is a large increase in young men. 1 in 5, I think, young men in Britain have been into church in the last year, which is a huge increase on recent years. But unless there is some kind of a Christian revival within, or just a generally classical revival within the culture, I can't really see how we would add to the canon. It feels like the time of the canon is going to be time bound between whatever you think the last edition, however informal it might have been, has been made to it, and whatever the first one was, presumably the Bible. But you've taught this stuff. You've been living this stuff. What do you make of that? Is that a crackpot theory, or do you think there's legs in that?
I mean, the thing about the canon, I mean, its detractors suggest it's parochial, it's irrelevant, it's all white, male, pale, stale, these sort of dreadful cliches. But that's all wrong. The canon is a conversation which goes back across many lands, I would say deep into ancient Mesopotamia, in the 2nd, 3rd millennium BC. It predates even the Bible. I mean, I think of the Epic of Gilgamesh as one of the earliest canonical texts, of course, only recovered in the late 19th century, perhaps even earlier than Scripture, but picking up certain themes from Scripture. And you have people over many times in many places, Mesopotamia, even Egypt, North Africa, Spain, the Balkans, in conversation with each other, and even across cultures, ultimately. I mean, whether you take, say, Avicenna and Averroes, who were from, in conversation with Christian scholars, who themselves, Averroes and Avicenna, who were drawing from Greek sources. These are long, long conversations with people in many different circumstances, and they are asking the big and the hard questions. And the thing about canonical literature, and the reason that it survives, is that it contains within it many perspectives, and it is not afraid of asking hard questions, even about that which is received. So I think especially George Herbert, who was my favorite poet, is not afraid to sort of call out to God. I struck the board and cried, "No more. I will abroad. What? Shall I ever sign pine? My lines and life are free, free as the wind, as large as store." So he thinks there's this idea of himself, the priest, the collar, being under the yoke. And then he goes on, and as I raved and grew more fierce and wild, methought I heard one saying, "Child," and I replied, "My Lord." And it goes into the depths. It asks the hard questions. It's not afraid to challenge and actually be completely honest about the difficulties that we have. Now, I think classical literature, and the great classical literature, like the Aeneid, of course, the great poem by Virgil about the foundation of Rome, of course, looking forward to Augustus. The epic poem did not hesitate to actually challenge the ideas of Romanists as much as to advocate them, and to talk about the deep, deep price that had to be paid in order to found the Roman Empire, in terms of the struggle, the sacrifices. Tantae mollis erat Romanum condere gentem is the Latin. So great a burden it was to found the Roman race. And it doesn't hold back on the shortcomings and the frailties of Aeneas as the hero, who was, of course, the type of Augustus. So even then, there is an honesty in the canon. And it's an amazing thing that you have this reconciliation of this idea of the establishment nature of the canon, the inherited nature, that it's a bulwark of the state on the one hand, and on the other hand, it has the capacity for opposition and challenge and holding it to account. And I think that's as much as the case in literature that comes in the Christian time, like George Herbert, like John Donne, "Batter my heart, three persons God." And it doesn't shy away from paradox, sort of looking at the idea of the strangeness of the idea of the virgin birth and God incarnate, addressing Mary, now has immensity cloistered in thy dear womb. That's the end of that sacred sonnet by John Donne. It will ask the hard questions, and that's why it lives, because it helps people to explore those most profound difficulties and questions. And I think the contrast between that which is great in the canon, of course, stuff written in the canonical time, some of it was terrible and is forgotten. But there's a process of time winnowing out what is good, and people will keep reading. And I think a problem with a lot of contemporary literature is that it simply tries to virtue signal. It doesn't ask hard questions about what contemporary morality is. It tries to, I think, propound, often in the contemporary world, notions of critical theory and intersectionality, and it doesn't try to turn the mirror on them and see what the problems are. It simply tries, in a very regime propaganda sort of way, to say the tradition is bad, the past is bad, this is all good, look at those terrible people in the past, and aren't we nice and well balanced and regulated and generally nice? And people don't want to read that because the ultimate problem about it is it's boring. The canon is interesting. The canon, you've got Satan, and Satan actually quite an attractive figure in Milton. High on a throne of royal state, which far outshone the wealth of Ormuz and of Ind, or where the gorgeous east with richest hand showers on a king's barbaric earl and gold. Satan, exalted sat by merit raised to that bad eminence, thus high uplifted beyond hope. Wow, that's exciting, isn't it? Wow, I want to see what he does next. You don't have, I think, that sense of the attraction of the opposition in contemporary literature. They don't even want it to be there. And I think that's a characteristic of a lot of contemporary culture.
Well, culture is often led by outstanding people. Sometimes they're heralded at the time, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're in positions of authority, sometimes they're not. But you've mentioned quite a few influential Englishmen during the course of this interview. Who would you say are the key figures in English Christianity who've had an outsized impact on the culture, remembered through the ages, and now, because of the reasons we've been talking about in this show, have now been forgotten, perhaps?
Okay, good question. Okay, top three. Number one is the Venerable Bede. Probably, we're on the eve of St. George's Day. I might put forward the controversial take, the Venerable Bede should really be our national saint. He is, I think, one of the leading people who envisages the idea of the creation of an English nation. I mean, long before it could actually practically and politically take place. The idea of one nation under God, under a king who answers to God for the morality of the people, and a king who is also under the law. But also ideas of, he has a sort of huge impact on us in terms of literature, the ideas of time. And here he has an international impact. So the year is 2025. Why do we use 2025? It's because of Bede choosing to use the Anno Domini dating system, which was in his time very new and actually very obscure. And for Bede, the year of our Lord, birth of Christ, the incarnation of Christ was the most important moment in human history. So he thought, okay, I've got millions of dating systems that exist, from the foundation of Rome, from the foundation of the world, whenever that was, the Olympiad system from ancient Greece, the Roman tax eviction system, the year of the martyrs from the reign of Diocletian, the year of the death of Mark Antony, the year of sort of various kings' regnal days. He said, no, let's work out English history so far in terms of Anno Domini. And he uses that, and suddenly it's a complete sort of eye-opener, because what looks like this sort of morass of sort of interweaving things happening there and there suddenly has a pattern. And what happens in these islands is connected to the incarnation of Christ, and it makes it appear suddenly that we have a sort of providential presence. The Romans come in AD 43. With Claudius, they go in 409, 410. Augustine arrives 597. Suddenly it's all clear. It's all related to the time of the incarnation of Christ. And time has a direction suddenly. That's because of Bede thinking very profoundly about time, the calendar, dating system. So, and also a great man of learning. He was proud of having the greatest library in Europe, in Wearmouth Jarrow, and proud as a teacher. So for me, he's one of the people. And his ideas of English nationhood go on to inspire Alfred, Ethelstan, when certainly with Ethelstan, the unification becomes a practical reality. And they draw from Bede's ideas and Bede's literature. I think after Bede, just jumping forward quite a long time, William Tyndale, who was, the greatest, most pioneering translator of the Bible into English. Before it was practically allowed in the first throes of the sort of Lutheran period on the continent. So his idea that the boy at his plough would know as much as the bishop of the scripture is indeed, it's a revolutionary thing. It shatters, in a way, the Christian order, but it generates a new one in its place. In a sense, it's rather like the fall of man itself. It's like the happy sin, whereby suddenly you have to think for yourself and make moral decisions and judgments on scripture. Now, of course, it can lead to terrible dissent amongst people, but it also leads to unity, and it can lead to great spiritual progress. So William Tyndale, for me, is number two. And of course, he revolutionized the language because he had this brilliant capacity for understanding the real power of English. But that was really developed to a certain extent, a combination of his sort of Gloucestershire background and his very practical, down-to-earth, industrial Gloucestershire industry, so agriculture, horses, cloth making, all this saws and the sayings to do with that. Earlier master, sooner knave, sort of little sayings like that. And combining that with the rhythms of Hebrew, which he found adapted themselves incredibly well to English. So instead of saying a beautiful woman, for example, he would say a woman of beauty. Apple of one's eye. There are so many phrases which take Hebrew grammatical and syntactical ideas, and they just work brilliantly in English in a sort of rugged, strong, concise way. And that molds good English. It's sort of rugged, concise, energetic, strong, direct, poetic, but rocky. So Tyndale, I think, is number two. And number three, well, I think it's going to be third equal because they're very much on the same hymn sheet. John Wesley and William Wilberforce. Both begin with a W, so that's good. Wesley with the evangelical revival. And again, taking Christianity as seriously as possible and working out its implications in national life and society and the obligations to each other, and really laying the foundations for modern ethical life. Charities, the way that we work together, and we're still living off that, the fumes of the tank. And Wilberforce is one of the great politicians of the 19th century who really put so much of that into practice. Of course, sorry, I said Wilberforce. I also meant the Earl of Shaftesbury. Sorry, I'm having too many heroes here. With the abolition of slavery, and then moving on to the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, Anthony Ashley Cooper. So many developments like rights for children, stopping sending kids up chimneys. Just making life better in so many ways, and working incredibly hard. You talk about drunkenness. He puts Dr. Bernardo up to the investigation of drunkenness and the reasons for poverty amongst the working classes. And he said, well, everyone's drunk. Everyone is drunk. There are sort of tens of thousands of pubs. Beer is cheap. Children at the age of 5 are going around taking sort of quarts of beer back home to their parents, but their children are drinking on the way and they're falling down in the street. There's no wonder children are orphans and just sleeping rough. So Bernardo, apart from setting up children's homes, he had this crusade against public drunkenness. Let's drink coffee instead of beer all the time. How about that? That might make life a bit better. So I think, how many heroes have I had?
That's
Bede,
5.
Tyndale, Wesley, Wilberforce, and Shaftesbury. So it's 5. It's quite a lot.
Well, that's good. I mean, if we want Englishmen to rediscover their heritage, then you've given them plenty of avenues to go and explore. Go and pick up some books on those people. I was very glad when you said Bede, and I knew Bede was going to come out. I'm a Northumbrian, so I'm very happy for him to be brought in there. You've been extraordinarily generous with your time so far, Bijan. I've got one question that I ask all of my guests who come on Thinking Class. And that question is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life that you once thought was perhaps set in stone and absolute? You certainly wouldn't change your mind on that. And then you did. And what was it that made you change your mind?
I'm actually going to tie it to the previous question. And I'm going to tie it to my admiration for Wesley, Wilberforce, and the Shaftesbury. I mean, in my personal religious life, I really tend towards the very high church Anglo-Catholic, contemplative background of Christianity. So, I mean, I must have thrown in another hero as Dame Julian of Norwich, this was a great elevated 14th century spiritual writer. And when I was at school, the only really vigorous part of Christianity that was there, apart from reading George Herbert privately to oneself, it was the evangelical side of the school. You had the Christian Forum, and I'm what do I do to be saved? I am saved. Hooray, I'm saved. All of that background. Now, because I fancy myself as deep intellectual, and I see the depths of Christianity and all the mystical and spiritual writers, and all of this evangelical stuff is just imposture and incredible, and it's got to be much more complicated than that. I had no respect for the idea of the evangelical tradition. And I got some terrible arguments with some of the teachers who were doing the Christian Forum side of things. I mean, all linked ultimately to Holy Trinity Brompton and so on, and the Alpha movement, the Alpha cause. And I think actually over the course of this book, even though my churchmanship hasn't changed, I think one of the sort of differences I have is I have a far greater respect for that different tradition within Christianity, and I think a far greater openness for those different spiritual responses, that sort of personal, immediate, ecstatic sense of personal salvation, which is, as I say, is not the way I've approached it or I belong to it, but I now completely respect that tradition within English Christian life, and I respect the inheritors of that tradition. And I repent of my earlier terrible contempt. So I think that's, it might not sound particularly significant, but I think for me there was actually quite a difference and a leap. And I think it might set me apart from some of my school friends who I'm still in touch with, who probably adhere to that sense of disdain for the other tradition. But I now have that greater reverence for the tradition, even if it's not my own.
Well, they were remarkable people. Similar to you, Bijan, I was drawn in by the contemplative angle, whether it was the early church fathers, Saint Augustine, all these people who wrote, which when you read their own accounts of their faith and their grappling with God and judgment and all of those things, that you could feel that too. You could relate to it, and you could spend time meditating on it and trying to turn things over in your mind about how that might lead to new action and metanoia, going beyond the mind that you already have, all those kind of things. And yet what the evangelicals got right, or get right, is the action bit. They just get to action. And you mentioned Wesley, and as you brought him up, it took me back to a book that I'd read not too long ago. It was by an Indian chap, and I can't remember his first name, but his surname was Malal Gandhi, and he wrote a book called The Book That Changed the World. And it was the impact of the Bible, and specifically the King James Bible, and all of the things that led to. And the passage on John Wesley and the Wesley brothers in general was remarkable. I mean, they would ride around the country on horses, setting up churches and civil society groups and charitable organizations to make sure that people were treated with the dignity that Christ gives them, I suppose. That and indeed, as you say, Wilberforce was an abolitionist, and the reason, one of the driving forces why we abolished slavery, and that was born of the evangelical movement as well. And yes, I had a very similar response, the crude, dismissive response in some way, and thought, oh, this isn't anywhere near complex enough. But actually, you can stew in complexity and theology and contemplation a lot of the time, but then it can actually stop you from living the Christian life in some way. And I liked what you said earlier on in the conversation, where you said some people in public life, I mean, many people in public life were so driven by their duty to God and thereby others, that there was no time for debate and conversation. It was just get to it. We know that it is wrong for these people to suffer this way, or for us to be even considering doing that thing. And I think we can probably agree that public life is somewhat diminished now when you look at where people derive their authority from. It's from distant courts. It's from similarly bureaucratic organizations that speak in a consulty kind of language, and there doesn't seem to be a deep moral and spiritual life there anymore. And I think for that reason, it's something that we've absolutely lost. And I think your book captures the things that we've lost. And I'm glad you wrote it, because it's testament to what the country has been, and it probably still is under the surface. And actually, because it's now there in print, and you've brought it down from the Tom Holland Western civilization to England, I hope enough people pick it up, Bijan, that it drives people to want to not just save the tradition, but to try and live it. So as a personal message, I'd like to thank you for writing the book, because I think it's a very important contribution to the national life and the understanding of the nation.
Well, that's extremely kind of you, and I'm very glad that you enjoyed it. And you said you've read it sort of, you sort of wolfed it down. I hope it didn't give you indigestion.
No, it certainly didn't, and it didn't aggravate my throat like your pistachios did either. Bijan, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I always ask guests what can we expect from them next. But I think, why don't we know your book's about to come out, and so perhaps we can tell the listeners and the viewers where they can find it and order it, and after that, maybe what else you might be considering working on, or where we can find your other writings.
Well, the book is in all normal outlets, Amazon, local bookshops, Hive, Waterstones, all the normal places, maybe even libraries, who knows. I'm writing, I write for various magazines, journals. The Critics, now the Spectator. After a break of 23 years, I mentioned Engelsberg Ideas. So I fairly regularly write pieces for them. And after this, I am I'm chatting with people and kicking around ideas, but I think there will be something connected with Christianity and the canon, but I'm probably not going to say much more than that at the moment.
Good. Well, for the discussion we just had and the book that I've just read, Bijan, I'm very glad you're going to take on that task. So I would love to be able to have you back to talk about things that you're writing in the meantime. But of course, when that book surfaces, whenever it does, in the meantime, Bijan, keep fighting the good fight. And thanks so much for joining me.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.